Colleagues, we'll continue with what is now our sixth panel and the last panel of the day in our consideration of Bill C-19, an act which would amend the Criminal Code and the Firearms Act, and this particular bill is referred to as an act ending the Long Gun Registry Act. And very pleased to have with us today three members of this particular panel. And I'll just go from left to right as I look to the end of the table. We have Dr. Langmann from McMaster University, who's a resident physician. Welcome, Doctor. We have from the Directors of Public Health of Quebec, the Regional Director, Dr. Jean-Pierre Trepanier. Welcome, Doctor. And again, from the Directors of Public Health of Quebec, the Planning Officer of Programs and Research, Claude Bégin. Welcome, Mr. Bégin. We'll proceed with opening statements, and Dr. Trepanier, I would ask you to proceed first.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, distinguished members of the Senatorial Committee. Good evening, and allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Jean-Pierre Trepanier, Director of Public Health at the Health and Social Services Agency of Lanaudière, and I am a spokesperson for the Directors of Public Health in Quebec. I'm accompanied by Dr. Hélène Dupont, Regional Director, Public Health, Outaouais, and Mr. Claude Bégin, our project manager for firearms at the Lanaudière Agency. I'd like to thank the committee to allow us this opportunity to express our point of view as the directors of public health in Quebec who are concerned about Bill C-19. We are very concerned, of course. We've tried to influence this process over the last few months. Last February, we addressed a letter to the honourable senators from Quebec to reconfirm the importance of maintaining the current bill, C-68, adopted in 1995. In November 2011, we addressed a letter to the chiefs or leaders of the parties in the House of Commons, and also to a CQ, which is the Standing Committee on Public and National Safety. Today, we would like to reiterate three principal elements of the briefs that we've put forward in the past. As in the past, we feel that Bill C-68 is an efficient measure. Bill C-19 would have as a consequence to dismantle a system which is efficient and saves lives and avoids serious injury. Further, the Long Gun Registry, which also hopes to see the destruction of data on several millions of arms which are not restricted, including hunting rifles and shotguns. This would remove a traceability capacity in the system, which would allow us to identify who the owner, the trader, or the salesperson of a weapon would be. Contrary to what is occurring in the United States, the possession of a firearm is a privilege in Canada, not a right. A possession certificate and mandatory registration of firearms are measures which aim to protect the population for the legitimate use of these firearms. As with a driving permit, or the registration of a car, these are accepted by the population. A firearm possession permit and the registration of individual firearms are essential measures. They allow the linkage to be made between the firearm and its owner, and to, in fact, make accountable the individual owner, forcing or obliging that person, rather, to respect the rules, storage, transportation, sale, etc. Just as you cannot rent a car in Canada without proving that you have a valid driver's license and that you have some insurance. Why would it be any different for possessors of non-restricted firearms? In this case, as with the Firearms Registry, the traceability function allows us to obtain information on the product, the resale, or the fencing of these weapons and other preventative measures. Second point, we'd like to emphasize that the coming into effect of C-68 was associated with a reduction of by 300 deaths a year. Approximately 70% of deaths linked with firearms are caused by long guns, unrestricted firearms. Suicides represent a majority of these deaths by firearms. Between 2004 and 2008, this represented 73% of deaths. Bill C-67 cannot, of course, eliminate all suicides, homicides, or accidents related to firearms. The National Institute of Public Safety in Quebec estimates that since its implementation between 1998 and 2004, there's been a reduction of 250 suicides and 50 homicides per year on average throughout Canada. This number represents one death a day that has been avoided year after year. A recent study concludes that more strict controls on firearms in place since 1977 were followed by significant reductions in homicides by firearm, approximately 5 to 10%, variable by province. The authors attribute this efficiency to the laws controlling firearms and the reduction of the accessibility to firearms rather than the hardening and toughening of sentences. Third element, firearms are dangerous for all. It's been shown that the deaths linked to firearms often concern or are centered on individuals who have problems, personal problems, marital problems, or mental health issues. And in most cases, this type of weapon should be less available to individuals who may make illicit use of them. The existence of a firearm in a home presents a danger to the other members of the family as well. In conclusion, given that Bill C-68 is an efficient measure to an essential lever to prevent deaths by suicide, homicide, or by accident, and that they limit dangerous firearms, dangerous to all, directors of public safety and cadet consider essential to maintain the registry intact as an indissociable part of the actual law. It links the owner in a chain of distribution all the way from the manufacturer to the ultimate user. We thank you for the attention that you will bring to our proposals, and in the perspective of public safety for Canadian population, we hope that the current committee will recommend to the Senate to abandon Bill C-19, recalling the merits and usefulness, the efficacy of the current registry for the long guns. On behalf of my colleagues, please accept, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee, our distinguished salutations.
We'll now proceed with Dr. Langmann and your opening statement.
Hi, thank you for letting me be here. I'd just like to ask all of you to turn to the brief that I presented to you. If you don't have those figures, I will pass them around. We're going to be going through some figures today, and I'd like you to follow along. Thank you very much. I'm an emergency physician in a busy city in Canada. I see trauma and suicide issues on a daily basis. During these next 5 minutes, I will summarize research that I have recently published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Interpersonal Violence regarding Canadian firearms legislation and its effects on homicide from 1974 to 2008. In particular, I will focus on the Long Gun Registry today, as that is the issue at hand. And I will also go into a brief detail on the association between the Long Gun Registry and suicide as it pertains to Canada. Briefly, 3 statistical methods were used during my research to attempt to find an association between firearms legislation enacted in 1978, 91, and 1995. And it's particularly important to note that the Long Gun Registry was implemented in 1998, and full mandatory registration was required by 2003. If you consult the Attorney General's report on that, you'll find that most long guns were registered in the 2002 age. This study is significant as it is the only peer-reviewed study examining 1974 to 2008, and that 3 methods were used to confirm the results. And a search for gradual effects was also conducted, as some of these legislations were enacted over a period of years. To summarize these results, no statistically significant beneficial associations between firearms legislation in Canada and homicide by firearms, by subcategory long guns, and spousal homicide, or the criminal charge of discharge of firearm with intent were found. Figure 1, if you'll turn to that, is a graphical, fictional depiction of a homicide regression analysis as performed in this paper. The homicide rate prior to the intervention is marked as beta 1. At the time of the intervention, beta 2, there is a sudden impact shift effect, shifting the homicide rate markedly lower in this fictional depiction. All right? The trend of the decline of the homicide after the intervention, beta 3, continues post-intervention over time. As you can see that it is different. Statistical effects are then analyzed. Figure 2 shows the firearms homicide rate minus the effects of contributing variables such as aging population, poverty, etc. on the bottom of this graph. As can be seen visually, there is no sudden shift or decline in homicide that one might expect from effects explained by legislation. Rather, other socioeconomic factors were found to be statistically associated with homicide by firearms. For example, the median age of the population increases by 1 year, the homicide rate drops by 8%. This is nothing remarkable, as has been shown in prior criminal research, that as the population ages, criminals tend to burn out. Figure 3 depicts a two-dimensional interpretation of multiple regression factors associated with firearms homicide. This is not a standard way of doing this in science, but I've done this for you so that you can interpret this. Post the Long Gun Registry, as marked in 1999, there is no significant immediate decrease over time or immediate decrease after the Long Gun Registry comes into effect for firearms homicide. Figure 4 depicts the same thing for homicide by long gun. Once again, there is no statistically significant decrease. Figure 5 depicts the same thing for spousal homicide. Once again, there is no statistically significant decrease in either impact or trend effects. Similar analysis is applied to suicide rates as per the method of Gagne et al. In the post-1991. This is to account for any background effects such as prior legislation. So 1991 is our start date, as the legislation C-17 came into effect that time. Figure 6 depicts total suicide. In 1999, there is no significant immediate impact or impact over time as affected by Long Gun Registry or probably PAL for that matter. Figure 7 demonstrates in regards to suicide by firearm that no significant immediate or trend effect is seen in 1999 as associated with the Long Gun Registry. So you can see I've actually blown up the scale here, but it looks rather flat if you look at it on a smaller scale. But you can see that the firearm rate of suicide is depreciating over time, and it continues that depreciation on a slower rate after the Long Gun Registry comes into effect. I would like to close by stating that in my humble opinion, the money that has been spent on the Long Gun Registry, which is unfortunately wasted at this time, however, we can prevent further waste by taking this money that we currently focus towards the Long Gun Registry and focus on this issue in terms of our time as well, and address other issues such as the lack of women's shelters that I see every day, the lack of suicide prevention and treatment that I see every day. More training for police in spousal abuse. Psychiatric care is sadly lacking in this country. Every day I turn away patients who come to see me for help. These are average Canadians who contribute to this country through their tax dollars that I have to say, no, I cannot send you to a psychiatrist because there is none available. I want this quote from an emergency physician, and this with a quote from an emergency chief of the Department of Emergency Medicine. In a town where we have over 15,000 registered and probably just as many unregistered firearms, and 22 trains travel through this town every 24 hours, the trains get used for suicide more often. What we need, from my point of view, is more resources to fund mental health access and treatment rather than registering inanimate objects in our rural community. Psychiatrists and outreach workers offer tangible results that are saving Canadian lives, something no gun registry on earth can provide. Dr. Oscar Ramirez, Chief of the Stevenson Memorial Emergency Hospital. My results are by no means rather astounding. They have been demonstrated by other meta-analysis done by the National Academy of Sciences, Center for Disease Control, that have looked at all papers, not just a selective biased analysis, and have come to the conclusion that in terms of registration of firearms, storage of firearms, licensing, that there is no demonstrable beneficial effect from these laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Langmann. Just before we go to questions, looking quickly through your submission here. The source of your data for the statistical analysis that you provided us with, I see, at least in part, it's from Statistics Canada information. Is that correct?
That is correct. All data is from Statistics Canada. There's over 300 data points used in this study.
All right. Are there any other sources for the?
No.
No. It's Stats Canada. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. We'll now move to questions from our committee members, beginning with Deputy Chair Senator Fraser.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you all for being here. Merci tout le monde. On apprécie vraiment.
Thank you very much to everyone. We appreciate your participation in our work.
Then subjected to various statistical manipulations. I'm a little puzzled. What I have in front of me is two things from you. And the first one says that you are prohibited by publication agreement from submitting your original study to this committee. And then the second half seems to consist of
the second half was submitted by Solomon Friedman. I did not submit my actual article.
And why can't you do that?
This is a fact of all scientific journals, all right? During the initial one-year printing process of all scientific journals, they require you to obtain these articles by either paying money or having a agreement with some of the providers, such as SAGE, which provides publication. This is not anything unusual.
No, you've answered, and I don't have much time, yes. So now I have another question for you, sir. I get the point, okay? Of which I was not previously aware. I take from your concluding remarks that you think that even licensing is irrelevant and that registration is irrelevant. Are you therefore saying we shouldn't even register handguns or the weapons that are now in the prohibited classification? Are you saying we shouldn't even bother licensing gun owners? I'm not sure how I should interpret your remarks.
Well, you've asked three questions there, so I'll address them all individually. So first of all, it's not my opinion, all right? I'm basing my information today on scientific fact, okay?
I asked for your opinion.
My opinion would be based on scientific fact then. So scientific fact, there is no, in terms of meta-analysis done by a National Academy of Sciences, this is by no means a biased institution funded by the NRA or something like this, as well as the Center for Disease Control. Both in 2004, 2005, in their publications determined that there's no beneficial proven effects, that the evidence is equivocal in terms of licensing. Those same groups can show that, blood alcohol 0.08 has a beneficial effect, so it's not like they're incompetent. You might want to ask yourself why these groups have difficulty finding beneficial effects from legislation. To go into that detail, that confused me as well as to why licensing wouldn't have a beneficial effect in terms of the numbers that we looked at. Gary Mauser was also able to obtain the same results as well as several other publications were too. So for 1977, when licensing first came into effect in terms of the firearms acquisition certificate. The suggestion is that there is a significant substitution effect where criminals will obtain, or people wishing to perform malicious activities will obtain firearms in another manner. That's been studied in Canada, and you can read in the back of the publication that I did not provide, that Solomon Friedman did. But you will find that there is one study that looked at how criminals were obtaining firearms in Toronto and where they were obtaining them from. And they found that criminals tend to trade firearms amongst themselves. They tend to borrow firearms for whatever particular use they're going to do with them. They don't tend to go to the store and buy them because
Dr.
they're easily
Langmann,
traceable.
I'm not trying to cut you off. It's all pertinent information, but if it's in the study, it's in the study. I asked about your personal opinion on licensing and on the registration of handguns and prohibited weapons. And I know the chair is going to cut me off. That's why I'm cutting you off.
What I'm telling you is that in science, personal opinion is not a factor, all right? Personal opinion might matter for something where you have qualitative data or experience. I have experience in emergency medicine. If you want to address that issue, you can. In science, you have to look at the facts, all right? And you have to make your decisions based on the facts. And I do this all the time in emergency medicine as well. According to the facts, in Canada, there's been no study on the registration of pistols. Pistols were registered in 1934, so I can't say anything on that. In the United States, as well as other countries, according to, once again, the CDC and the National Academy of Sciences, their meta-analysis showed that the results were equivocal. So in other words, they could not demonstrate that there was a beneficial effect. In terms of registration of prohibited firearms, which include pistols, as well as certain firearms based simply on looks, and some firearms based on, as well as restricted firearms, which I believe you're talking about.
Yes.
Prohibited firearms require a 12.6 license, who few people have, but restricted firearms based on looks, based on barrel length, a lot of the firearms that are included in the restricted category were probably put in there simply based on looks. And so there would probably be no effect if you were to unlicense those. Registration of those came into effect in 1977, partly, and then in 2000, then in 1991. And as my study shows, there was no beneficial effect associated with those legislations.
Senator, as you predicted, we're going to have to move along. Senator Chaput, you have
Yeah, okay. What?
Supplemental.
It's to Dr. Langmann. It's a supplementary question to the Senator Fraser's question. What is the scientific definition of beneficial effects? Seeing that what you're saying is based on science, what is the scientific definition?
So in medical science and in economic science and socioeconomic science, what you do is you choose a statistical value where something would be found to be 95% of the time effective, all right, or different from what else would have occurred. That is a benchmark that is generally accepted. In my study, the values of statistical difference were even better than that, to put it sort of a layman's term. So that's what it's based on.
And different being what?
So you can maybe apply it to something like the use of a drug. So does aspirin have a beneficial effect in preventing heart disease?
And for this registry here, the different being what? If you're saying that there was no significant beneficial effect.
So the p-value is less than 0.05.
Pardon me?
P-value is less than 0.05. That's what it means. If you want me to go into more detail, I can.
No, that's okay. That's all right. Whether I understand or not is another thing.
It's peer-reviewed, so scientists understand.
Senator Lang.
Yeah, just if I could, Mr. Chairman, because I think it's important for the record, because we've had evidence over the last, today specifically, and I believe a number of times before, and the question of suicide has come up, and I appreciate the doctor doing the work that he's done. I don't think I fully understand how you got to where you were, but it's very interesting to see, obviously, the interest that you've taken and the fact that this has been peer-reviewed, obviously, from what you've indicated very rigidly along the guidelines that are established by the science community. So I think that's important to point out. But the interesting aspect, and perhaps I'd like you maybe to expand on a little bit more, and that's your figure 7 in your document. You say suicide by firearm rate per 100,000. Per 100,000. At any rate, it shows a very marked decline, significantly, and then it coordinates with some other information that Lauren Gunter, gun control advocates, entitled "Gun Control Advocates Play Disingenuous Game with Suicide Stats." The fact that the suicide rate has been being reduced, and you can't, the registry really isn't a factor in respect to that. Maybe just expand a little bit further on that, because I think it would perhaps help clarify it for all members here before we make a decision.
So if you look at the graph, what you see is, and I've tried to make it simple so that people can understand. So you see a firearm suicide rate declining, all right?
Yeah.
And then the year 1999 is indicated by a straight line going up. And then you see after that, firearm suicide declining in less of a manner, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't see a big jump you don't see a big step shift of the decline either. Right. And so if you did see a shift, or if you did see a significant trend or increase in the decline afterwards, then that would suggest that the firearms Long Gun Registry has had an effect in preventing suicide, as it increases the rate of decline of suicide, right? Obviously, a statistical analysis is done. This is just a depiction of that on a graph. The interesting thing is that in 1991, SSRIs, which are an antidepressant medication, were introduced in both Canada and the United States. And we saw in the United States as well a marked decline in suicide, especially by teenagers, not associated with any legislation that I'm aware of at that time as well, which sort of matches what we're seeing in Canada in terms of firearm suicide. As well, you see a shift, and that's called the substitution effect, where people choose another method to kill themselves with. In particular, that is hanging in Canada and in the United States. And hanging, as has been shown in several studies, so firearm suicide is about 83% effective, and hanging is about 82% effective at ending your life. So they're both pretty significant. Obviously, we can't ban rope. So there's been a large number of studies which are covered, once again, by those meta-analysis that I talked about, but in Canada as well. I'd like to read you one of them that was done by Dr. Caillin, just because it was done in one of Canada's highest suicide rate area, and that is in the Abitibi area in northern Quebec on the Indian Reservation. And what they did is they looked at the effects at the rate of suicide by firearm after C-17 when background checks came into effect. And what they found is that while the rate of gun ownership dropped and the rate of suicide by firearm dropped, the overall rate of suicide increased by about 11%, mostly by hanging and by other forms of poisoning. So what we really are concerned about is does any of our legislation have an effect on the overall suicide rate? It will have an effect, as has been demonstrated, on firearm suicide, but does it cause people to hurt themselves less? And the peer analysis appears to be that there is a significant substitution effect. And that's what I'm concerned about mostly, because that's what I see. I don't have anywhere to send people, and that's a big problem.
Well, just for the record here, Mr. Chairman, if I could, what you've just basically stated here is what this other information that I have here that basically says the suicide has stayed consistent, the numbers,
overall rate,
although the method of suicide has changed.
And we're not sure why that method has changed.
Yeah. So just if I could, Mr. Chairman, I just want to go follow up with the other witnesses on another area here, if I could, because I think it's important, because we're talking about a registry which we are getting a lot of evidence and a lot of testimony here is inaccurate, has majority of law enforcement officers, frontline officers, don't support the Long Gun Registry because they feel that the information in good part is erroneous and puts them in a situation of false security. But I want to direct Dr. Tapener to the area of the licensing itself, because obviously you're very knowledgeable on the legislation. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the view of the fact that licensing of the individual is staying in place, the requirement to apply for a license, the requirement to have to take the test for the license, the requirement to have references, the requirement to have 80% plus for the purposes of the of passing the exam. So there's a number of steps there that are very rigorous and very rigid to ensure that those that have a firearm license are meet the qualifications. And I can't forget the fact that, and I impress upon everybody, that you have to have the reference checks, not only the reference checks by the police, but you also have to have some references from the community to prove that you're a bona fide applicant for such a license. Do you feel that licensing is working and it is working as a screen, at least in part, for those individuals who should not be getting a license, that this is in place and it is working to some degree? Perhaps you could tell us something on that.
En fait, je pense que ce qui est important.
Well, I think what's important, and the message we'd like to send today, is that our mandate as directors of public health is to examine the issue in a proportional fashion, not an individual case by case. We have a mandate which is to protect the health of our population. If we wish to fulfill our mandate, we have to ensure that we analyze the issues to find solutions which could improve the health status and the wellness status of our population. There's not one single measure that can do so. If we take a look about suicide prevention, for example, there's not one simple measure that can do it. It's a combination of measures which have to be put forward, not only in individual behavior, but the context, the environment, the milieu, not only the physical environment, but the legislative environment. The totality of laws, regulations that a society will give itself to live in a harmonious fashion. We feel that we control a number of consumer goods, for example. We ensure that their use or their application is as rigorous and as honest as possible. I'll give you an example a while ago of a vehicle, a car. It's quite analogous with firearms. We insist that the vehicle be registered and that the driver be registered. And we're looking here at a combination of measures for driving a car. The individual has to pass a test, and, well, it has to have insurance and another of other measures. With a firearm, as with a car, we understand that most users are using it quite legitimately and quite prudently. However, there's an intrinsic danger to this other good, this other product, just as with a car. A car can become a weapon just by the laws of physics. I mean, so we feel that it's absolutely reasonable to insist that there be some control on firearms very similar to what we have on vehicles. I don't know if my colleague would add something to that. If you'll allow, yes. Laws that would stem or subsequent to a registry would in fact enhance and enforce the system per se. Once, when the system was put into place in Canada for car registration, it took years before the system was fine-tuned. I don't know how much it cost, but I'm sure that it cost quite a bit of money to transport Canada or the provinces. There were costs associated with registering cars. But over the years, the registration of vehicles improved, and the quality of the data was improved. I think the same is true with firearms data. We were told that initially the quality was poor or there were many mistakes, but they've improved over the years. And I think it's quite possible for public agencies, government agencies, to improve the quality of data. We do it in many, many other areas, public health areas, public safety issues. We do the same with cars. But laws that stem from this registry allow us to gather not only information on holders of permits, permit holders, be they firearms or cars, but also for individuals who are doing research or people like us who are involved in prevention and health. It allows us to take a look at the data, the files, to do various studies, analyses to see if we have vulnerable populations or whatever, and base various research which might lead us to propose further policies or programs or other regulations, for example. We've changed the laws on speed, for example, on inebriation, drinking and driving. The age varies for having a permit. Finally, we have a...
Just tighten it up a bit here. We've got a number of others that wish to ask questions.
Je m'arrête pour l'instant.
Right, thank you. I'll stop there then.
Tighten questions and responses. I realize there's a lot to be said, and we want to hear from you, but if we could keep it as concise as possible. Senator Hervieux-Payette.
First of all, I would like to congratulate the 16 directors, I think, for the excellence of their research, with their references to a number of other experts as well. I'd like to know who was involved in the preparation of this document. Was that within your offices, or did you farm out the research, or how did you go about it? Well, we referred to, first of all, the National Institute for Public Health. They had also tabled a brief to the Standing Committee at the other place, the House of Commons, on a previous bill, 391, I believe. The National Institute for Public Health is an organization which provides advice to the Ministry of Health and the Department of Public Health in Quebec. It's a third-party autonomous agency which deals itself with a number of researchers, one of which, Etienne Blais, who also I think appeared earlier, last fall. Part and parcel of the information and access to research and a review of the research, of course, that we have available to us. We based it on rigorous research that's been done, and it's a meta-analysis. We worked with Mr. Bégin for the drafting. Okay, that would indicate that this is not a personal opinion, but rather a collective research product. I notice a little note here. I have a little note here. Perhaps it allows you to conclude on a matter of statistics. Here's a lady, Barbara Veal, Initiative for Prevention of Suicide in Switzerland, is convinced that the restriction of firearms would allow the reduction of numbers of suicides. Those countries which have more rigorous controls and controls have seen a reduction in the suicide numbers. Earlier this afternoon, I gave numbers on the numbers of arms, weapons that are in free circulation in the U.S. and in the U.K. and in Switzerland. It's the higher the free circulation of arms, the higher the incidence of suicide, homicides. and the lower, it's directly proportional. So if we liberalize controls, or if we eliminate controls, because it's pretty much what we're going to be doing, are we not endangering public health and safety? I would answer probably yes. The National Institute for Public Health published a report in 2010 in Quebec as to suicide rates in Injury Prevention magazine. It's a professional journal, if you will, well rated. That among young men, the suicide rate is closely related to has gone down significantly since the introduction of C-17. The consequences on firearms in Canada has taken some time to be felt. It took several years before all the measures, all the provisions of this, under its various reincarnations, of course, came into effect. Now, I don't want to be told that I'm taking too long, but as for death by hanging, this started going down since 2000, for example, the year 2000. So there may have been no substitution effect. Initially, there might have been, but now it's going down all throughout Quebec. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
First of all, that study, as mentioned, did not show any effect at C-17. That's incorrect. It showed an effect in 1995, and that was the legislation C-68. Secondly,
I think the senator was asking which study you referred to. A study.
The Gagné study that was in Journal of Prevention of Violence.
Yeah, excuse me. Go ahead.
The other point I'd like to make is that there is no inclusion of any other dependent variables in that study. In other words, they didn't look at income, they didn't look at poverty rates, they didn't look at the invention of new treatments such as SSRIs, which have had a significant impact in treating suicide in terms of also affecting impulsivity. In terms of people who are who are thinking about committing suicide, and preventing that. Also, that there are many other studies that have shown that while if you do limit the number of firearms, it does reduce suicide by firearms, but that there is a significant substitution effect. There are several in Canada, Caillin et al. In 2008, Carrington and Moyer in 1994, also showed that there's no correlation between the number of firearms and firearm suicide rates in Canadian provinces. In other words, provinces with high firearms ownership did not have an increase in overall suicide rates. I'd also like to point out another study done by Sloan et al. In 1990, which compared Seattle and Vancouver. Seattle has a higher firearm ownership rate. Their gun laws are much more progressive than they are in British Columbia in terms of people being allowed to own firearms. They showed that while there was an increase or a greater rate of suicide by firearm in Seattle, the overall suicide rate between the two cities was equal. And this compares two rather equivalent cities that I'm well familiar with in Canada and the United States. So it is important to look at large meta-analyses done that look at all studies. And the CDC and the National Academy of Sciences does that. And that is peer-reviewed. I'd also like to address the 250 number that my colleagues here have presented, which I've never seen published in any peer-reviewed journal. I would like to see how that they came up with those figures. I'd like to point out that if we look at overall, so they're suggesting there's 250 less suicides every year since the introduction in 1998 of the Long Gun Registry and the PAL. And I'll read out the numbers so we can look at that. In 1996, the reduction of suicide was 33 by 33, so it's 33 less suicides. 1997, there were 65 less suicides. 1998, there were 0 less suicides. This is StatsCan data. In 1999, there was 11 less suicides. In 2000, there was 122 less suicides, but it also correlates with a 209 less suicides in other methods in that year, and I'm not sure why. There must have been something going on at that point in time. So,
debate about their statistic. We have several other studies. Are we going to go through?
I'm almost done.
No, that's fair enough. I thought it was in response to an issue you raised, and if you've heard sufficient, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you. We have 4 senators left in first round. Senator Boisvenu.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you very much for your briefs. They were very instructive. Instructive because I think that we're getting away from a subjective debate. We're starting to cool it and see it in a more objective fashion. In a former life, I was in social economic development in Quebec, and there were 3 great crises. 82, 84, 92, 95, and 2008. Now, we saw an increase of suicides in 82 and in 93. Do you think that the economic situation would have more impact on the number of suicides? Suppose a head of a family is without work for 30 months. Do you think he's more liable to commit suicide because he's unemployed for 30 months or because there's a gun in the house? You're asking me if it would have more impact? I cannot say if it would have more impact. Does it have an impact? These economic cycles and suicide rates, I think that there's a very close correlation. There's an excellent correlation between rising suicide rates and economic hard times. So if you were going to try to reduce suicide rates, you'll have to do more than limit access to methods of suicide. I mentioned earlier that there's no measure on its own singly that would reduce or eliminate suicide. And suicide is a very important public health issue, closely related to the ups and downs of the economic cycles. If we want to take measures to counter suicide, we have to have a whole panoply of interventions. Individually, collectively, we have to act on a number of fronts. We have to develop better treatments, eradication of mental health status, try to dissuade people from attempting any method of suicide. And I think that having a registry perhaps help us.
In all of this, but it's C19 we're talking about, so if we could try to
Une dernière question, Monsieur le Président. Votre document.
Final question, Mr. Chair. We have 2 documents. One was very brief, and the others was quite a lengthy document, including Dr. Réal Lacombe signed it. We studied together. You indicate in your memoir, in your brief, that there is a relationship between the introduction of the gun registry and the incidence of suicide rates. How can you affirm that so categorically? A reduction in homicide, suicide, because in a period where from 79 to 95, for example, the suicide rate was less than when the registry was there, for example. I don't see how you link it so directly, a correlation. There were faster, lower reduction in suicide rates without a registry than with the registry during certain years. Are you based on Statistics Canada only, or have you conducted any independent research studies? Look, the tendency with suicide has been downward for a number of years, perhaps several decades. Now, to determine the supplementary consequence of a measure or a law is quite difficult to do when the general tendency is downwards, let's say. However, one has to develop a methodology which allows us to demonstrate that. We have to measure it and sample it appropriately, and it's not easy to develop such a methodology. It's taken a number of years before we've been able to obtain data on the effects of or the consequences of laws. since 1977. Various studies by Etienne Blais and the National Health Institute have allowed us for the first time to cast some light on these issues. Now, perhaps my colleague could add a bit more precision to that. Only to say that, yes, there is a tendency since the 70s to see a reduction in suicide rates. This doesn't invalidate results. In any case, it's a general tendency for suicides. The same is true for homicides. There's been a downward trend in homicide and suicide. Now, using the methodology that our colleagues used, since approximately when C-68 came into effect, there has been a marked reduction. Now, it could have other correlates as well, because this was based on all provinces in Canada, and by province, we have accumulated a result for a Canadian average. And we've seen the same, we've observed the same thing since the 70s, a reduction in death rates on the roads. It doesn't mean that measures since then have had no effect on accident rates or motor vehicle mortalities. So, like I said before, it's a number of laws together, an integrated set of laws, regulations, and such that will give these results.
Hi, I have a question for you, Dr. Trepanier. I apologize, I don't know as well Quebec as I should. When you say you're from Health Quebec, is that the sort of the department of, like we have Health Canada, we have in British Columbia we have Department of Health? Is that the number of? Is that what it is?
En fait, bien entendu,
Well, health is a provincial jurisdiction. We have the Public Health Agency of Canada, of course, which oversees all sorts of activities. We have a department, our Ministry of Health, and within the Ministry of Health, we have a branch or a directorate for public health. We also have a regionalized administration to our hospitals and health services, of course, with other agencies, health boards, if you will.
Had a pretty big sample that you were looking at when you were doing your research, isn't that correct?
La recherche que...
Well, the research, yes, that was conducted. We didn't conduct it personally ourselves, of course. It was done by a researcher, Etienne Blais, with the support of the National Health Institute. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in technical descriptions, but the analysis was conducted on a province-by-province basis, and it allows us to make better comparisons and analyses than had we tried to aggregate the whole result for all of Canada. So that's what makes that study rather powerful, rigorous. I can't give you all the details, of course, but we are quite confident in the results of that research.
Sitting here, listening to the three of you talk about all the different research, the thing that goes through my ears is what the earlier Linda Silas said, is to be precautionary, take the precaution rather than the numbers that the number of people die. And I'd like your comment on, is this to keep the gun registries to be precautionary, to prevent deaths? It doesn't matter if it's 1 death or 100 deaths, it's to prevent deaths. Isn't that what we're talking about?
Vous savez, c'est certain qu'il faut regarder l'ampleur.
Well, yes, we have to look at the extent of this phenomenon to see what the impact of these measures are. This is not the first time that we have scientific data which indicate a trend, whereas one study or two might be going in the opposite direction. We can't wait until we are happy that everything is all going in the same direction before we act, before we protect public health and public safety. I believe that we have sufficient data, reliable data, which indicates a certain efficacy of this registry. And if the data are contradictory, I don't think that that's an indication that we should immediately scrap the registry. I think probably the contrary is true. Let us maintain the registry until we can positively prove it not to be valid. and effectively, we have efficiency here. Now, are there subgroups where this may not apply? It's essential to have the data. Otherwise, we can't really make any pronouncements on that. Once it's abolished, it'll be far too late.
Two very brief comments. One, if I practiced medicine on a precautionary basis, I would admit every patient to the hospital, and you guys would be bankrupt. All right? We do have to make decisions based on evidence, and every now and then I send home a patient who dies. Based on the evidence, they should not have been admitted to the hospital. They pass away, and that's what we have to do here. We have to decide what is financially and what is safely beneficial. And there's a lot of studies that show that Long Gun Registry has had no effect. The Blaze study only used 2 dependent variables. I used 7 or 8, depending on which one I was looking at. And if you read the footnotes of their study, you see most of them were taken out.
Thank you, Senator. We have 2 senators remaining. We are running over, but it's the final panel, and so they will have their opportunity. Senator Runciman.
And I just can't help but respond to something Dr. Trepanier said, that we need more time on this, but it's been 17 years and over $2 billion of taxpayers' money, so I guess there's no end in sight. I want to congratulate Dr. Langmann. I guess CPAC could, in this segment, they could title it Battle of the Docks, but I really appreciate the work you've done here with respect to the study, and you're a bit of a voice in the wilderness, I think, in the medical community. And we have people appearing before us, and we've heard over the years with respect to suggestions of impacts here, but nothing to back it up is in terms of significance the way you and have looked at this issue. And you're pricking some balloons. You can see that here tonight. When people get upset when they're hearing these facts placed in front of them. So I simply want to commend you. I want to ask the other witnesses here that are you suggesting that you are disputing the findings and conclusions of the peer-reviewed study that Dr. Langmann has undertaken? Is that what you're telling us here today?
Pas du tout. Pas du tout.
No, not at all. I would never contend or pretend to contest the results of someone else's research. I simply mentioned that the study on which we based our conclusions is reliable, conducted by credible researchers, and it's been published in journals. But I'm not looking for an experts debate this evening here. I represent the public health institutes in Quebec. Our mandate is to protect public health, and suicide prevention is one of the elements that we'd like to bring to your attention today. We shouldn't forget the importance of having traceability of data in order to continue to understand the phenomenon and to take informed decisions based on fact.
That I'd like to get your response to the World Health Organization, and this is the most recent year available, 2011, and the high suicide rates. And this indicates that the United States has lower suicide rates than, and this is by country, and by year and sex. And we all know that it has much looser gun controls, if you will, than Canada does. I just wonder, how do you explain something like that?
Comme je vous mentionnais tantôt, le contrôle des armes.
Well, as I indicated earlier, firearms control is one element of what we have among an arsenal of other methods to try to prevent suicide. It's not the only tool that we have. We can't establish a correlation one-on-one like that, whether it's efficiency or not.
And here we have perhaps the loosest gun control laws in the world, and they have higher suicide rates. So I think there is a correlation here. I don't think you can ignore that. You shouldn't, anyway.
Can I comment?
Well, no, I think it was directed towards Dr. Trepanier. Do you wish to comment on that, Doctor? Or are you?
Il ne s'agit pas de l'ignorer, mais on pourrait penser.
Well, we're not ignoring it, but if we didn't have the register, I think the margin would even be wider. And we don't deny that suicide is not a public health issue. It is a public health issue. We have to keep it in consideration. That's why we're presenting it to you today. It's a major, significant issue. Bill C-19 is more than just a criminal matter.
Last Senator, last question of the day, and it goes to Senator White.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll just be brief. You left a commentary in the air, Dr. Trepanier, that us knowing the vehicle identification number in a car makes the driver safer and actually would reduce deaths. I can't make the correlation between knowing a VIN number, a vehicle identification number, and knowing a serial number of a weapon. It is about the driver as it is about the person who has the weapon. It's about the regulations around training and testing and psychological well-being and all of those things in both cases. But knowing the VIN number does not reduce the number of accidents. In fact, the VIN number is collected for sales tax, insurance purposes, and many other things, but not to make that driver a safer driver. I just want to, I guess I have to put this into a question. I guess you would agree that wasn't your intent to suggest knowing the VIN number would actually make for a safer driver, is it? Dr. Trepanier, actually made this statement.
Okay. En fait, ce qu'on mentionnait tantôt, c'est qu'on.
Well, what we were saying earlier is that you were drawing a parallel, an analogy, if you will, between two situations. We're talking about consumer goods. They're not. I mean, firearms are not exactly common, but and automobiles have a special regime also. But the fact of registering a vehicle, the fact of having a driver's license will, in fact, make drivers more accountable. And that's the same should apply to firearms. There's a matter of accountability. It's also a matter of messaging the community. It's the message you sent. This is not just consumer goods like every other. There's a concern here for public safety when one talks about guns or cars. And we need to create an environment which is safer, perceived to be safer, and people will respect the law.
Colleagues, that concludes our time with this panel, and as we've heard from many of our witnesses, and I think it was no more clearly illustrated than the three excellent witnesses before us on this panel, there are different thoughts, different viewpoints, and thoughts that have been well considered, but people do have different views of it, and that's exactly why we go through this process, so that at the end of it we've considered everything that we believe is relevant. So you've been extremely helpful to us in a very learned way, all three of you, and we deeply, deeply appreciate the time and attention, detailed attention you've given this. So thank you so much. Colleagues, we will adjourn, and no, we're not going to keep going, Dan. We'll adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you so much.